Yeah.
And so that's kind of how I think about it.
You recently reported that your yearly revenue from AI is $13 billion. But if you look at your year-on-year growth on that, in like 4 years, it'll be 10x that. You'll have $130 billion in revenue from AI if the trend continues. If it does, what do you anticipate we're doing with all that intelligence? If, like this industrial scale use, is it going to be like through Office? Is it going to be you deploying it for others to host? Is it going to be, you got to have the AGIs to have 130 billion in revenue? What does it look like?
Yeah, I see the way I come at it, Dwarkesh, is it's a great question, because at some level, if we're going to have this sort of explosion, abundance, whatever commodity of intelligence available, the first thing we have to observe is GDP growth, right?
Yeah.
Before I get to what Microsoft's sort of revenue will look like. I mean, there's only one governor in all of this, right? This is where a little bit of, we get ahead of ourselves with all this AGI hype, which is, hey, you know what? Let's first see if, let's say remember, like the developed world is what? 2% growth. And if you adjust for inflation, it's 0.
Yeah.
So in 2025, as we sit here, I'm not an economist. At least I look at it and say, man, we have a real growth challenge.
Yeah.
So the first thing that we all have to do is and when we say, oh, this is like the Industrial Revolution, blah, blah, blah. Oh, let's have that Industrial Revolution type of growth. That means, to me, 10%, 7%, developed world, inflation adjusted, growing at 5%. That's the real marker, right? So it's not just, it can't just be supply side, right? It has to be, in fact, that's the thing, right? I think there's a lot of people are writing about it. I'm glad they are, which is the big winners here are not going to be tech companies. The winners are going to be the broader industry that uses this commodity that, by the way, is abundant.
Right.
And suddenly productivity goes up and the economy is growing at a faster rate. When that happens, we'll be fine as an industry. But that's, to me, the moment, right? So us self-claiming some AGI milestone, that's just nonsensical benchmark hacking to me. The real benchmark is the world growing
right
at 10%.
Okay, so if the world grew at 10%, the world economy is 100 trillion or something. If the world grew at 10%, that's like extra 10 trillion in value produced every single year. If that is the case, you as a hyperscaler, it seems like 80 billion is a lot of money. Shouldn't you be doing like 800 billion? If you really think in a couple of years we could be really growing the world economy at this rate, and the key bottleneck would be, do you have the compute necessary to deploy these AIs to do all this work?
I mean, that is correct. And so therefore, but by the way, the balance is like, I think a little bit of it is right now is like, hey, let me, like the classic supply side is, oh, let me build it and they'll come, right? I mean, that's an argument. And after all, we've done that. We've taken enough risk to go do it. But at some point, the supply and demand have to map. And so that's what I think, and that's why I'm tracking both sides of it, right? So that's why I think, you can go off rails completely when you're like all hyping yourself with all the supply side, versus really understanding how to translate that into real value to customers. And so that's why I look at my inference revenue. That's one of the reasons why even the disclosure on the inference revenue, it's interesting that not many people are talking about their real revenue. But to me, that I think is important as a governor for how you think about it, right? And you're not going to say, oh, they have to symmetrically meet at any given point in time, but you need to have existence proof that you are able to parlay yesterday's, let's call it, capital into today's demand, so that then you can again invest, maybe exponentially even, knowing that you're not going to be completely rate mismatched.
Yeah. I wonder if there's a contradiction in these two different viewpoints, because look, I mean, one of the things you've done wonderfully is you make these early bets when there's you invested in OpenAI in 2019, even before there was Copilot and any applications. If you look at the Industrial Revolution, these 6-10% build outs of railways and whatever things, many of those were not like, we've got revenue from the tickets and now we're gonna whatever.
There's a lot of money lost.
That's true. So if you really think like there's some potential here to 10x or 5x the growth rate of the world, and then you're like, well, what is the revenue from GPT-4? I mean, like, if you really think that that's the possibility from the next level up, shouldn't you just like, let's go crazy, let's do the hundreds of billions of dollars of compute? I mean, there's like some chance you get that.
Right? I mean, like the thing is like, here's the interesting thing, right? The real question, quite frankly, to answer is, is this just about, like, that's why even that balanced approach to the fleet, at least, is very important to me, right? Which is, it's not about building compute. It's about building compute that can actually help me not only train the next big model, but also serve the next big model. And you understand, until you do those two things, you're not going to be able to really be in a position to take advantage of even your investment, right? So that's kind of where it's not a race to just building a model. It's a race to creating a commodity that is getting used in the world to drive. So you have to have a complete thought, not just one thing that you're thinking about. And so that's, at least in my view, of saying, hey, and by the way, one of the things is there will be overbuilt. To your point about, you sort of said what happened in the .com era.
Yeah.
And I look at it and say, now the memo has gone out that, hey, you need more energy and you need more compute. Thank God for it, right? And so everybody's going to race. In fact, I look at the number, it's not just companies deploying, countries are going to deploy capital. Yeah. And they will be clearly, like, I'm so excited to be a leaser, because, by the way, I build a lot, I lease a lot. I am thrilled that I'm going to be leasing a lot of capacity in 27, 28, because I look at the builds and I'm saying, this is fantastic. The only thing that's going to happen with all the compute builds is the prices are going to come down.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of prices coming down, you recently tweeted after the DeepSeek model came out about Jevons paradox. And I'm curious if you can flesh out. So Jevons paradox occurs when there's, like, the demand for something is highly elastic. Is intelligence that bottlenecked on prices going down? Because when I think about at least my use cases as a consumer, it's like intelligence is already so cheap. It's like 2 cents per million tokens. Like, do I really need it to go down to 0.02 cents? I'm just, like, really bottlenecked on it becoming smarter. And if you need to charge me 100x, do a 100x bigger training run, I'm happy for companies to take that. But maybe you're seeing something different on the enterprise side or something. What is the key use case of intelligence that really requires you to get a 0.002 cents per million tokens?
I mean, I think the real thing is the utility of the tokens, right? So, which is, in some sense, both need to happen. One is intelligence needs to get better and cheaper. And anytime there's a breakthrough, like even what DeepSeek did or what have you, with the efficient frontier of, let's say, performance per token changes, and the curve gets bent, and the frontier moves, that just brings more demand. And so that's sort of how I look at it. And that's what happened with cloud, right, by the way. Here's an interesting thing. We used to think, oh my God, we've sold all the servers in the client server era, except once we sort of started putting servers in the cloud, suddenly people started consuming more. Because they could buy it cheaper, and it was elastic, and they could buy it as a meter versus a license. And it completely expanded. Like, I mean, I remember, like, going, let's say, to a country like India and sort of talking about, oh, here a SQL server. We sold a little, but man, the cloud in India is so much bigger than anything that we were able to do in the server era. And that, I think, is going to be true. If you think about, like, if you want to really have in the global south, in a developing country, if you had these tokens that were available for healthcare, that were really cheap, that'll be like the biggest change ever.
I think it's, like, quite reasonable for somebody to hear people like me in San Francisco and think, like, look, they're kind of silly. They don't know what it's actually like to deploy things in the real world. As somebody who works with these Fortune 500s and is working with them to deploy things for hundreds of millions, billions of people, what's your sense on how fast deployment of these capabilities will be? Even when you have working agents, even when you have things that can do remote work for you and so forth, with all the compliance and with all the inherent bottlenecks, is that going to be a big bottleneck, or is that going to move past pretty fast?
It is going to be a real challenge, because the real issue is change management or process change, right? I mean, this is here's an interesting thing, right? Which is, one of the analogies I use is just imagine how a multinational corporation like us did forecasts pre-PC and email and spreadsheets, right? I mean, faxes went around. Somebody then got those faxes and then did an interoffice memo that then went around, and people entered numbers and then ultimately a forecast came maybe just in time for the next quarter. Then somebody said, hey, I'm just going to take an Excel spreadsheet, put it in email, send it around, people will go edit it, and I'll have a forecast. So the entire forecasting business process changed because the work artifact, and the workflow changed. That is what needs to happen with AI being introduced into knowledge work. In fact, when we think about even all these agents, the fundamental thing is there's a new work and workflow. Like, for example, for me, like even prepping for our sort of podcast, I go to my co-pilot and I say, hey, I'm going to talk to Dwarkesh about, our quantum announcement and this new, model that we built for game generation, and just kind of give me like a summary of all the stuff that I should read up before going.
Right.
And he knew like the two Nature papers, it took that. In fact, I even said, hey, go give it to me in a podcast format. And so it sort of even did a nice job of two of us chatting about it. Like, so that became, and in fact, then I shared it with my team, right? So I took it and put it into Pages, which is our artifact, and then shared. So the new workflow for me is I think with AI and work with my colleagues, right? So that's a fundamental change management of everyone who's doing knowledge work, suddenly figuring out these new patterns of how am I going to get my knowledge work done in new ways. That is going to take time. It's going to be something like in sales and in finance, in supply chain. So for an incumbent, I think that this is going to be one of those things where, let's take one of the analogies I like to use is what manufacturers did with lean. I love that because in some sense, if you look at it, lean became a methodology of how one could take an end-to-end process in manufacturing and become more efficient, right? It's that continuous improvement, which is reduce waste and increase value. That's what's going to come to knowledge. This is like lean for knowledge work in particular. And that's going to be the hard work of management teams and individuals who are doing knowledge work. And that's going to take its time.
Can I ask you just briefly about that analogy? One of the things Lean did is physically transformed what a factory floor looks like. It revealed bottlenecks that people didn't realize until you're really paying attention to the processes and workflows. You mentioned briefly how your own workflow has changed as a result of AIs. I'm curious if we can add more color to what would it be like to run a big company when you have these AI agents that are getting smarter and smarter over time?
Yeah, in fact, it's interesting you asked it. Like I was been thinking about, like, for example, today if I look at it, we are very email heavy. So I got in the morning and I'm like, man, like my inbox is full and I'm responding. And so I can't wait for some of these co-pilot agents to kind of automatically populate my drafts so that I can start reviewing and sending. And so that's kind of one. But literally, I do feel like I already have in Copilot like at least 10 agents, right? I have, which I do because I query them as sort of different things for different tasks. And I feel like there's a new inbox that's going to get created, which is my millions of agents that I'm working with will have to invoke some exceptions to me, notifications to me, ask for instructions. So at least what I'm thinking is that there's a new scaffolding, which is the agent manager is going to be that one. Like, it's not just a chat interface. I kind of need a smarter thing than chat interface to manage all the agents and their dialogue. So that's why I think of this Copilot as the UI for AI is a big, big deal. And each of us is going to have it as, so basically think of it as there is knowledge work and there's a knowledge worker, right? The knowledge work may be done by many, many agents, but you still have knowledge worker who is dealing with all the knowledge workers. And that, I think, is the interface that one has to build.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of curious about like